Bionic Commando grappled its way onto your NES back in 1988. Developed and published by Capcom, Bionic Commando is a port of the arcade game of the same name, but that's generally where any similarities end. The original arcade game was, at its core, the same action platform game we'd end up seeing on the NES, with the main gimmick being a grapple arm that your character could use to navigate the stage with, rather than just simply jumping around like just about every other platform-style game at the time. It was a fun and unique way to traverse stages, but unfortunately, besides that one neat gimmick, the arcade version of Bionic Commando never really caught fire with people. Thankfully though, Capcom decided to do something completely different with the NES version of the game and made it into a direct sequel to Commando, the insanely popular overhead shooter that Capcom had already released into arcades and onto the NES a couple of years prior. The NES version of Bionic Commando would end up taking some of the top-down stages of Commando and combine it with the grappling mechanics and platforming of the arcade version of Bionic Commando, creating an open-ended action platform game that was incredibly unique for the time. But did unique translate into fun? Or was this Commando grappling onto thin air? Well, slap on your favorite hook grapple arm thing, because we're about to see if Bionic Commando is worth reaching for. Start up the game and you'll get a story that would get any Bionic Commando's blood boiling. Essentially, a bunch of top-secret plans were created by some sort of old evil empire called Bats, and has now been discovered by the current evil empire with their General Jesus, ready to complete the plans himself. The Federation forces that you fight for are not too surprisingly none too happy about that, and have sent their best commando, Super Joe, to find their secret plans, but of course they've lost contact with him in the process. Now it's up to you, the player, to find Super Joe and stop General Kilt from doing whatever it is he's doing. And if you're wondering where the tie-in with the original Commando game comes in, well, you just missed it. Turns out that Super Joe was actually the character you played as in that game, which is a fun answer to a trivia question that no one will ever ask you. From that point, the story cycles back to the start screen, which means the game's telling you to just go ahead and press the start button and stop wasting everyone's time with this story stuff. Once you're done getting hyped up for some hardcore Commando action, you'll get a brief introduction through your radio about what the hell you're even here to do, and then be placed in front of one of the more confusing map screens you could probably ever imagine for a game of this type. Instead of the mostly useless progression maps of other games, or even the choose-your-own-path style maps like Mario 3, Bionic Commando presents you with a bunch of boxes with numbers in them, connected via lines. As a kid, this was probably the first thing about Bionic Commando that genuinely perplexed me, and just makes zero sense at all. None of the numbers are in any sort of numerical order, as they're just kind of laid out all over the map, seemingly at random, with lines going through them that aren't even connecting in any semblance of order. You can tell your helicopter to navigate to any level connected by a line, but even when you get to a level, the game doesn't force you to enter it. Instead, you can choose to start the level or simply fly to another level. And if you happen to run into one of the enemy trucks as you're flying between levels, you'll get tossed into a Commando-like top-down shooting level for a minute, and then be sent back to the map screen once you make it to the end. For a first-time player, this isn't exactly intuitive, but even if you are as confused as I was as a kid looking at this hot mess of a map screen, just go ahead and navigate to the first actual stage you can fly to and get down on the ground to start your hunt for Super Joe. Finally get into a stage and you're met with a more familiar action platformer, with your character being able to run and shoot around the screen like the game you probably thought you were getting when you looked at the back of the box. That is until you get to the first barrel that's in your way and come to a dead stop. Yes, it appears that even though you're some sort of amazing super commando, no one actually trained you on how to jump. Instead, it's apparently easier to use your experimental grapple arm to grab onto ledges to swing yourself around small objects and pull yourself up to ledges above. And if you're new to the game, then getting used to moving through a level using this thing is probably going to be more challenging than any actual enemy you come up against. Shooting straight up to climb to a higher ledge is simple enough. It's just when you have to use it to swing across gaps or to other platforms is when it can get a bit awkward. And until you master it, then get ready to scream more than a few death threats at your TV because your grapple arm didn't land you where you thought it would, or pulled you directly up into an enemy's ass. Thankfully though, as awkward as it can be at first, the grapple arm can be mastered, and once you do, you'll be swinging around levels like some sort of ninja commando. It's incredibly rewarding being able to swing up and around enemies or across pits of spikes using this thing, and thankfully it never gets old. If you can get used to swinging your way around levels, then the rest of the gameplay should be fairly standard to anyone that's played a shooter on the NES, though it's not always as simple as just shoot your way to the end of the stage, fight a boss, and then rinse and repeat until the credits. No, Bionic Commando can be a bit more obtuse in how you progress through the game. While you definitely do have stages where you can just mow through enemies, make it to the boss, and move on, others require certain items to make it through. For instance, if you navigate to the stage numbered 4, which is actually the second level of the game, told you this would get confusing, you'll find yourself in a cave that's too dark to see anything. To make it through this section, you'll need a flare that you can find in the stage numbered 13. And just how would you ever know this? Well, as you progress through each level, you'll come across transmission rooms that you can use to get valuable info from your commando buddies in the field. And when I say valuable, I mean you would literally have no idea what to do in this game if you miss some of these. Obviously, the flare is easy enough to figure out on your own, but later in the game you'll get directions to secret tunnels you'd never even be able to see, or where particular weapons are that are required to beat a level, along with even being able to hack enemy transmissions to find out where certain objectives are that you'd never know otherwise. And it's also worth noting that some of these rooms can be easily missed as well due to the maze-like design of some levels. So if you miss just one of these, then be prepared to hit several brick walls throughout the course of the game. This goes back to why the map screen lets you fly to any stage in any order, as you'll probably be backtracking more than a few times just to figure out where to go next. Thankfully, once you've figured out what the game is wanting you to do and how to go about doing it, the rest of Bionic Commando settles into a fun, challenging action platformer. Every stage is almost completely unique from the last, with almost all of them focusing on making you use your bionic arm to navigate past new and ever more difficult obstacles. Just when you think you've got things down and are feeling pretty confident with swinging around the levels, the game tosses in a whole new section of spikes and bottomless pits to punch you right in the gut. Sadly though, the challenge doesn't really extend to the game's enemies and bosses, as they're all mostly fodder for you to shoot your way through, and really only become a nuisance when they finally show up in numbers. Most just kinda stand around and shoot at nothing until you decide to put them out of their misery, while other more mobile enemies do the whole run around aimlessly and hope that the player's dumb enough to eventually run into them. The bosses that occupy the end of each stage are generally even less of a threat than the standard enemies, as it's usually easier just to blow past them entirely and destroy the reactor at the end of the stage rather than try and beat them as well, especially when some are just content to stand completely still, swinging their batons in the air like some sort of kid that's had way too much sugar. And even when the game tosses in a larger boss at you, defeating them is usually just a matter of finding a spot where they can't touch you and unloading your gun into them. I think it's safe to say that if you're looking for any sort of quality enemy AI, then Bionic Commando isn't going to be the game for you. Still though, the challenge of making it through the stages with your grapple arm is by far and away where the difficulty in Bionic Commando shines, and it definitely delivers in spades in that department. Playing Bionic Commando throughout the years has certainly given me a greater appreciation for a game that I quickly dismissed as a bunch of bullshit when I was younger. As a kid, the concept of how you were supposed to progress through this game completely flew over my head, especially since the video store decided not to include any instructions at all with the game that I rented. So I spent about 4 or 5 hours wandering through the game aimlessly with only a slight grasp on what I was even doing. It ended up being one of those rentals that I kinda regretted and took back to the video store asking myself why I ruined a perfectly good weekend on this when I could have just rented Mario 2 for the 14th time. Thankfully though, I continued to stick with Bionic Commando over the years, mostly just because I was frustrated with myself because I didn't understand it. And after a few friends and gaming magazines pushed me in the right direction, I was soon having a blast grappling my way through each stage. And besides getting used to the whole grappling thing, which honestly is a fairly large hurdle for anyone that's never played this, there's still a really great game here for anyone to enjoy if you're patient with it, especially with the aid of numerous walkthrough videos and guides littered across the internet for it. And if you already tried it in the past and were put off with it like I was, then maybe give it another go. I guarantee if you stick with it, this is one game that you'll be grappling onto time and time again. The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse magically appeared on your Super NES back in 1992. Developed and published by Capcom, Magical Quest was one of the last in a line of Capcom-developed Disney games that included all-time classics like DuckTales, Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers, and Darkwing Duck, among others. And while Capcom had seen considerable success on the NES with its Disney games, it had yet to release anything using the license on the Super NES nearly 2 years after it had already been on store shelves. But Capcom would finally end that drought when they saw fit to grace the Super NES with Magical Quest in late 1992. And even though it was just a game starring Mickey and his buddies, the early previews of it at least made it look like a gorgeous game that was maybe taking more than a bit of inspiration from the excellent World of Illusion for the Sega Genesis, with its focus on using magic throughout the game. But was it a return to form for everyone waiting patiently for their Capcom Disney gaming fix? Or was Capcom just tossing out something to make a few bucks while other developers were giving much more lucrative Disney movie licenses? Well, grab your favorite wand and robe, because we're about to see if Magical Quest is worth conjuring up. Start up Magical Quest and you get a plot that would make even the youngest of kids playing it roll their eyes in boredom. Essentially, Mickey, Goofy, and Pluto are all out playing catch when for some reason Goofy launches the ball as hard as he can, sending Pluto on a mad dash after it. Apparently no one was able to see where Pluto ran off to, so Goofy initially goes to find him, but Mickey quickly realizes that Goofy probably isn't the best option for such things. Mickey then takes it upon himself to be the smarter, more responsible person to find Pluto, only to immediately plunge off of a cliff. Somehow by doing this, Mickey ends up in a magical land with no real explanation as to how or why. And while you can always insert your own dark storyline about how Mickey actually died when he fell off that cliff and is now in some surreal afterlife, you'd probably be doing your sanity more of a favor by pressing start to get this magical train rolling. Taking control of Mickey may at first seem like you've entered yet another mascot platform game where the most advanced technique to master are jumping on top of enemies and across platforms. And while you can definitely do those things, Magical Quest does throw in a few interesting mechanics to break up the colorful monotony. First off, while Mickey is totally comfortable murdering enemies with just his butt, he can also grab blocks that are hanging around the level, tossing them at enemies whenever you let them go. If you ever played Rescue Rangers on the NES, then you'll feel right at home doing this in Magical Quest as well. Mickey can also grab other things hanging around the levels like gold blocks that spit out bonus items, using fruit as a helicopter to reach higher areas, or even picking up and tossing smaller enemies once they're dazed. And while it's pretty fun to pick up and throw things with wild abandon, this whole idea is kinda thrown out the window once the game starts introducing special costumes in Stage 2. Essentially, these costumes can be changed into at any time and give Mickey a whole new set of attacks and abilities that his normal self can't use. For instance, your first costume will be a magician's outfit that allows Mickey to charge up and shoot magical blasts, which is definitely helpful when dealing with enemies that Mickey can't assault up close with his ass. Using these costume abilities will ultimately drain your magic power though, which can only be refilled by finding power-ups around each stage. If you run out of magic power, then you may as well switch back to normal Mickey, as most of the costumes don't do much without it, and also doesn't allow for Mickey to grab and throw things either, unless you're using the Mountaineer costume. As you'd expect from a game that gives you new abilities as the game progresses, each new stage generally has a focus on using your newly found outfits, like putting out fires and moving blocks around with your fireman costume, or scaling mountains and grabbing onto platforms Captain Commando style using the Mountaineer costume. Each new costume feels completely different from the last, and mastering them is actually pretty fun, and gives the game some solid variety where it would otherwise just be another mascot platform game. Sadly though, even with all of this stage and costume variety, Magical Quest isn't really challenging or long enough to let you use them as much as you'd want to. The game is only 6 levels long, with the first 4 mainly focusing on using the costumes that the game introduces in each of those stages. In fact, only the 6th and final stage actually gives you a level that seems to push you into using multiple costumes to make it to the end. So if you were expecting the game to give you more chances to experiment with the whole costume thing, then you'll probably be disappointed, as most levels seem to push you into using only one specific costume. Bosses continue that trend, with most of them dependent on using the costume you found in that stage to defeat them, though a few do allow you to switch things up a bit if you want to. But doing so will probably only make things more challenging if you stray away from what the game actually wants you to use. And if you're expecting Magical Quest to offer up a hefty challenge that would maybe offset the game's short length, then you should probably temper those expectations before jumping in. Even at its hardest difficulty setting, Magical Quest probably won't take you more than a couple hours to beat, especially with with the infinite continues and generous checkpoints it gives you to do so with. And with no real reason to play through again besides trying a harder difficulty level, if you didn't already start at the hardest difficulty level, then you'll probably be left wondering where the second half of the game magically vanished to. By the time Magical Quest released, I'd kinda moved on from the hardcore Disney fan I was back in the NES days, but it still didn't stop me from picking it up as soon as I saw it on my video store shelf. At the very least, you could generally always depend on Capcom Disney games to offer up some solid gameplay, and Magical Quest definitely has a fun take on your standard platform game, even if the whole costume thing isn't used as much as it could have been, and the difficulty is a bit on the way too easy side of things. Personally, I never really cared as a kid that the game wasn't very long or challenging, simply because I usually only had a few days to play it until I had to return it to the video store. So any game I could completely beat in a short period of time kinda made me feel like I got my money's worth. Though I could definitely see some buyer's remorse if someone had paid a full $60 for Magical Quest back in the day, expecting more than just a couple hours of gameplay before the credits roll. Despite the negatives though, Magical Quest is still an enjoyable game for anyone that's a fan of Capcom developed Disney games, especially if you go in expecting a great looking stress-free game featuring Mickey and his friends. And if you can manage that, then I guarantee that you'll wish this Magical Quest had materialized in front of you sooner. Mario Paint drew its way onto your Super NES back in 1992. Developed and published by Nintendo, Mario Paint definitely wasn't your standard game you would expect to be released on the Super NES at the time. In fact, even calling Mario Paint a game is a bit of a stretch. It's actually a very early version of a traditional digital paint program that you would commonly find on personal computers, with the ability to use various tools to draw and animate images on your monitor. Obviously, this was a bit different from the shooters and platform games that littered the system at the time, and as such was met with more than a few confused kids when Nintendo Power started promoting the game over the course of several issues, along with Nintendo desperately trying to convince all of us kids that digital paint programs were totally radical.
Actually read their minds. Should we fry him or boil him? Whoa, so I pushed a button and made him disintegrate. Okay, so I made it up. Then I made it all happen.
But was Nintendo actually right? Was Mario Paint in fact a genuinely fun creative experience? Or was this yet another attempt by Nintendo to toss out a gimmick that landed with all the excitement of a wet fart? Well, grab your favorite art palette and easel, because we're about to see if Mario Paint is the masterpiece Nintendo thought it was.
Oh, yeah. Mario Paint.
Before we get into what Mario Paint actually is, I should probably mention what came packaged with the game. Now, since Mario Paint is, well, a paint program, naturally you would think you'd need a proper drawing tool to use it, and that's exactly what Nintendo stuffed inside the box with the game. Yep, every copy of Mario Paint included both a mouse and a mouse pad so that you could awkwardly draw on your TV until your heart's content. And while that was totally awesome at the time, it probably shouldn't surprise anyone that this isn't a very high quality mouse, even by 1992 standards. First off, the left and right mouse buttons are rectangular strips divided awkwardly across the front of the mouse, making it far harder than it should be just to rest your fingers on it properly, especially for someone that had never even used a mouse, like me. And of course, since this was the Stone Age, the mouse was using rollerball technology to track movement, which meant that even when you managed to use the face buttons properly, the mouse just wasn't very accurate at moving things around the screen. Also, the rollers inside the mouse would gunk up super quick, meaning you had to take it apart regularly to clean it, or the on-screen tracking would get even worse, with frequent skips, or the cursor even just refusing to move at all. This was an even bigger problem if you were using the included mouse pad, which was just a hard slab of plastic that drew dirt and hand grease to itself like a magnet. Still though, I guess you can't expect too much for what Nintendo was charging for this thing, and what was included was more than adequate enough to get your ideas up on the screen in some form. But if you're attempting to use it now, then be prepared for a lot of frustration in trying to make it do anything that you want it to do. Once you've got the hang of holding onto your new mouse, then it's time to fire up the game proper and start creating. As mentioned before, Mario Paint is a very early version of a PC paint program, and one that's stuck on a home console at that. So don't go in expecting anything close to what you'd normally see even on a basic paint program these days. And seeing Mario Paint's main art studio screen is more than enough to hammer that home. The tools provided to create your masterpiece are little more than a few different brush sizes, a meager selection of colors at the top of the screen, and a few other things like a fill bucket and some shape tools to make some basic shapes without having to rely on the mouse. Using these tools should allow you to create some fairly fairly simple art, though the low resolution of the canvas certainly hampers your ability to create anything involving fine details. Combine that with an already substandard mouse that hates doing anything you tell it to, and your hands will probably be cramping up within minutes of getting anything close to what you have in your head up on the screen. At least using the tools are simple enough, and everything is laid out right on the screen instead of having to dig through menus. This makes Mario Paint incredibly easy to pick up and immediately start drawing whatever you want, which is by far the game's most successful feature as far as being an art program that anyone can create basic art with. And while the toolset and hardware certainly limits what you can accomplish with Mario Paint, Nintendo did at least include more than enough pre-made extras to play around with if making stuff on your own gets too tiring. This includes a large number of ready-made stamps featuring the Mario crew and other objects that you can use to insert just about anywhere, multiple color patterns to liven up your creation in some pretty trippy ways, and even a coloring book feature that lets you skip the whole drawing thing and just fill in the colors like a 2-year-old. Beyond that though, there's not much more to help you along, so it's definitely going to be up to you and your imagination to make the most out of Mario Paint. Thankfully, Mario Paint isn't just limited to drawing, and actually includes an animation studio so that you can not only draw whatever you want, but also attempt to animate it as well. And if you thought the drawing aspect of Mario Paint was basic, then you probably won't be getting too much out of the animation side of things either. You can choose between 4, 6, or 9 frames of animation to use to animate your abomination, with the higher numbers reducing the frames to an almost comically small size. Your only help with animating is the ability to copy one frame to another, with nothing even as basic as showing transparencies to help you out. So everything you change for the animation will just have to be through comparing and contrasting previous frames, which isn't exactly ideal if you've ever animated anything before. If you somehow manage to make something you're happy with, you can then use the pathing tool to drag it around anything you drew in the art studio to give your twitching, horrific creation the illusion of movement. It's cool Nintendo even included it, but overall the animation segment of the game is probably the weakest of the bunch, unless you just have a thing for creating the worst animation projects known to man and then forcing your friends to watch them, which I most certainly do. Rounding out the modes in Mario Paint is actually the one the game's still most well known for, music composition. Now, as simple as everything else in Mario Paint has been up until this point, you'd think making music would be even more limited. After all, music composition on its own is fairly complex. Amazingly enough though, Mario Paint has included a decently full-featured music creation tool that allows you to place icons that all have pre-made sounds attached to them around a bar line to create just about anything you want. Each of the icon's sounds will pitch up or down depending on where you stick it on the bar line, along with allowing you to place up to 3 icons with it to create more advanced compositions, if you know what you're doing at all. Speaking of the sound effects, special mention should be made for the variety and just how strange some of these things are. While you definitely get some that sound like actual instruments, a good chunk of them just seem to be random noises and animal sounds. So if you ever wanted to make your own symphonic masterpiece consisting of nothing but cat meows, well, Mario Paint has you covered. At least until someone comes and forcibly removes the mouse from your hand. Now, to me personally, this whole thing may as well just been completely useless, since I was about as musically inclined as a deaf frog. But to other, more talented people, this became the entire reason to buy Mario Paint. In fact, if you see anything regarding Mario Paint these days, it's usually due to someone making some new insane composition using this tool. And that's seriously impressive, since I still to this day have no clue how to make anything on it not sound like someone fell over on top of a keyboard and died. So if you're musically talented at all, then this aspect of the game is actually still worth checking out, just for the incredibly strange compositions you can create using these weird sound effects. When Mario Paint first came out, I was absolutely blown away by the concept of being able to use a device like a mouse to draw images on a screen. And while that idea wasn't exactly brand new at the time, I never had access to computers that allowed me to do such a thing before, let alone something as crazy as using a mouse to do it with. In fact, Mario Paint's actually the first thing that taught me how to use a mouse, long before I was actually sitting in front of a computer with one. And I realize that this may all sound preposterous in this day and age, but I can assure you that things were quite a bit different back in 1992. And having access to such an affordable program and tools to properly use it back then was nothing short of inspiring to a 12-year-old kid like me. And that's exactly what it ended up doing, inspiring me. It immediately made me aware of just how much I enjoyed digital art and got me to continue doing it all the way up to present day. Sadly though, the game itself is one of those games that just hasn't aged well, and probably for obvious reasons. Sitting back down to Mario Paint these days and trying to do anything with it on the art side of things is a mostly painful experience. Unless you want to compose some music with it, the technology and hardware just doesn't hold up, no matter how many little extras Nintendo tossed in here to try and make it more fun. But that doesn't mean I still don't absolutely love this game, and as basic as it was, it still managed to introduce me to a passion of mine that will probably stay with me for the rest of my days. All thanks to a basic paint program, the worst mouse ever made, and a little Nintendo creativity.